17-year-old Ethan Walker entered the Franklin County courtroom with a chilling display of arrogance, laughing at the family of the man he had brutally murdered, David Campbell. Confident his youth would be his shield, he treated the proceedings as a joke, unaware that the system was closing in around him. But the most damning testimony would not come from an expert or an officer, but from the one person who knew the truth behind his monstrous facade, his own mother. The evening of October 12th descended upon the quiet suburban streets of Westerville, Ohio, with a familiar autumn chill. Leaves skittered across manicured lawns under the sterile glow of streetlights, each home a small fortress of warmth and routine against the encroaching darkness. Inside his modest two-story house on Maple Creek Lane, 52-year-old David Campbell was settling in for the night, the aroma of a late dinner still lingering in the air. He was a man of quiet habits and simple pleasures, a high school history teacher who had spent 3 decades shaping young minds with stories of the past, utterly unaware that his own story was about to reach its brutal and senseless conclusion. The tranquility of the neighborhood was an illusion, a thin veneer stretched over a darkness that was about to rupture the community's sense of safety. David Campbell had lived in this house for nearly 20 years, his life a testament to stability and kindness, known for his meticulously kept garden and his willingness to lend a hand to any neighbor in need. That night, the only sounds were the distant hum of traffic and the rustle of the wind, a peaceful symphony that gave no warning of the violence to come. The attack was not a robbery gone wrong or an act of passionate rage. It was an intrusion of pure, unmotivated malice, an event so savage it would leave investigators searching for a reason that simply did not exist. The first official record of the tragedy came at 10:47 p.m., logged as a terse, anonymous 911 call reporting screams from the Campbell residence. The dispatcher heard only a few panicked words before the line went dead, a chilling silence that prompted the immediate dispatch of 2 patrol cars. Officers arrived within minutes to a scene of unsettling normalcy. The porch light was on, a newspaper lay on the welcome mat, and there were no visible signs of forced entry. It was only when they peered through a side window into the living room that the illusion shattered, revealing a scene of such profound violence that it would be seared into their memories for the rest of their careers. Inside, David Campbell lay on the floor, his life extinguished in a brutal, chaotic struggle that had overturned furniture and left crimson stains upon the pale beige carpet. The sheer savagery of the attack was immediately apparent, far exceeding what was necessary to subdue a single man, suggesting a rage that was both personal and deeply pathological. The initial search of the home yielded no immediate motive. His wallet was on the kitchen counter with cash still inside, and valuable electronics remained untouched, systematically dismantling the theory of a simple burglary. The only thing taken from the house was a life, leaving behind a vacuum of grief and 1,000 unanswered questions that would soon fall to the Westerville Police Department to answer. The crime scene was a testament to nihilism, a violent statement without a clear purpose, and the detectives knew their investigation would not be about following the money, but about tracking the monster responsible for such a pointless act of destruction. The notification to the family was a task dreaded by every law enforcement officer, a delicate and terrible surgery on the soul of a family. David's sister, Amelia Sanchez, received the call just after midnight, the clinical voice of the detective on the other end of the line, cleaving her world in two. Disbelief was the first wave of defense, a desperate hope that this was some horrific mistake, a confusion of names or addresses that would soon be corrected. But as the detective gently but firmly insisted on the facts, her denial crumbled, replaced by a wave of grief so immense it felt like a physical drowning, pulling her under into a cold, dark reality from which there would be no escape. She and her husband drove to the police station in a state of shock, the familiar streets of their city now alien and hostile territory. At the station, the grim reality of the situation was laid bare in the sterile, fluorescent-lit confines of a small interview room. Detectives offered their condolences, their words professional yet imbued with a shared human sorrow, but the details they provided only deepened the horror. They spoke of a home invasion, of extreme violence, but could offer no explanation, no context for the madness that had stolen her brother from the world. Amelia's mind reeled, trying to connect the image of her gentle, bookish brother with the brutal scene the officers described, but the two realities could not coexist. The man they were talking about, the victim of a savage attack, was not the David she knew, the uncle who brought her kids silly gifts and spent hours debating historical events with a twinkle in his eye. The initial stages of the investigation were a blur of procedural necessities and raw emotion for the Campbell family. They were asked for names of potential enemies, for details of David's routines, for any shred of information that might illuminate the darkness that had consumed him. But David had no enemies. He was a man universally liked, a fixture in his community whose only conflicts were gentle disagreements over historical interpretations with his students. The family's search for answers became a desperate circular exercise in futility, their grief compounded by the utter senselessness of the crime. The absence of a motive was a particular kind of torture, as it denied them the small comfort of understanding, leaving them to grapple with the terrifying knowledge that such profound evil could exist without reason or warning. The community of Westerville reeled from the news, which spread like a poison through the town's bloodstream. A murder in their quiet suburb was rare enough, but the brutal, inexplicable nature of David Campbell's death sent a shockwave of fear and disbelief through the populace. He was not just a name in a news report. He was Mr. Campbell, the teacher who made history come alive, the neighbor who always waved, the familiar face at the local grocery store. His death was a personal violation to the thousands of lives he had touched, a stark reminder that the carefully constructed walls of suburban safety were fragile and easily breached. Vigils were held, and makeshift memorials of flowers and candles grew on his lawn, small gestures of collective grief against an overwhelming tide of sorrow and confusion as an entire town waited for the answer to a single terrifying question: who could have done this? The investigation did not languish in uncertainty for long. In a world of digital footprints and constant surveillance, hiding from a crime of this magnitude had become an almost impossible task. The break in the case came not from a mysterious informant or a complex forensic puzzle, but from the mundane, ubiquitous technology of a neighbor's doorbell camera. The device, positioned across the street from David Campbell's home, had captured a grainy but clear image of a lone figure walking away from the house at approximately 10:35 p.m., just minutes before the 911 call was made. The individual was young, dressed in dark clothing, and moved with a casual, unhurried gait that was chillingly at odds with the horror that had just unfolded inside. Detectives spent the next 48 hours canvassing the neighborhood, cross-referencing the image with local school yearbooks and social media, a painstaking process of digital forensics that soon yielded a name: Ethan Walker. He was a 17-year-old high school senior who lived just a few blocks away, a teenager known for petty delinquency and a simmering, defiant arrogance, but nothing that would have suggested a capacity for such extreme violence. He had been a student in David Campbell's history class 2 years prior, a fact that added a disturbing layer of familiarity to the crime. With a positive identification from multiple sources, the Westerville police obtained a search warrant for the Walker residence and an arrest warrant for Ethan, preparing to confront the young man whose image was now the focal point of their homicide investigation. The arrest was executed on a crisp Thursday morning, the tactical team descending on the Walkers' modest suburban home with a quiet, practiced efficiency. There was no dramatic standoff, no chase. Ethan's father answered the door, his face a mask of confusion that quickly morphed into dawning horror as he read the warrant. Ethan was found in his bedroom playing a video game, the sounds of simulated gunfire filling the small space. He looked up at the officers who flooded his room with a look not of fear or surprise, but of bored annoyance, as if their intrusion was merely an inconvenient interruption. The armor of his adolescent detachment was impenetrable, and he offered no resistance as he was handcuffed, his eyes empty of any discernible emotion. During the search of his room, detectives found the evidence that would forge an unbreakable link between Ethan Walker and the murder of David Campbell. Tucked away in a laundry hamper were a pair of sneakers, their soles stained with a faint reddish-brown that lab technicians would later confirm was a perfect match for the victim's blood type. A black hoodie, matching the one seen in the doorbell camera footage, was found stuffed under his mattress. The most damning discovery, however, was a decorative knife missing from a collection on his dresser, a fantasy-style blade whose unique serrated edge was consistent with some of the wounds found on the victim's body. The physical evidence was overwhelming, a silent, irrefutable chorus of testimony against the blank-faced teenager who now sat in the back of a police cruiser, watching his life recede in the rearview mirror. The interrogation began later that morning in a small, windowless room at the police headquarters, a sterile environment designed to amplify psychological pressure. Ethan Walker sat slouched in his chair, his demeanor a study in adolescent apathy, his gaze fixed on a point on the wall just above the detective's head. His parents had invoked his right to an attorney, but before the lawyer arrived, Ethan, with a misplaced confidence in his own intelligence, waived his right to remain silent, eager to engage in what he clearly perceived as a game of wits. He seemed to believe he could outsmart the seasoned detectives, a fatal miscalculation born of a deeply ingrained narcissism and a profound underestimation of the system he was now facing. The initial questioning was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, with the lead detective, a veteran of hundreds of such interviews, adopting a calm, almost paternal tone. He did not accuse, he asked questions, circling the event without ever directly addressing it, allowing Ethan to build his own scaffold of lies. Ethan claimed he was home all night, that he knew nothing about the incident, his answers delivered with a rehearsed smoothness that betrayed their falsehood. He leaned back in his chair, affecting an air of casual indifference, but a slight, persistent tapping of his foot betrayed a flicker of nervous energy beneath the placid surface. The detectives let him talk, giving him enough rope, knowing that his arrogance would eventually become his undoing. The turning point came when the detectives laid a single photograph on the table between them, a still frame from the neighbor's doorbell camera, clear and undeniable. It was a simple, powerful move, the first crack in Ethan's carefully constructed facade of invincibility. His casual posture tightened, his eyes darting from the picture to the faces of the detectives, the faint smirk he had been wearing finally dissolving. For the first time, a flicker of genuine emotion, not remorse, but anger at being caught, flashed across his face. The game had changed, the balance of power had shifted, and the walls of the small room seemed to close in around him. With his alibi shattered, Ethan's demeanor underwent a chilling transformation. The pretense of innocence fell away, replaced by a cold, matter-of-fact confession delivered without a trace of guilt or regret. He described breaking into David Campbell's house through an unlocked back window, not to steal, but because he was bored. He recounted the confrontation with the homeowner, the ensuing struggle, and the act of violence itself, his voice a flat monotone, as if he were describing a scene from one of his video games. There was no emotional inflection, no hesitation, no hint that he was talking about ending a human life. It was this complete and utter absence of empathy, this chilling void where a conscience should have been, that was more shocking to the detectives than the brutal details of the crime itself. His confession was not a cry for help or a release of a terrible burden. It was a boast, the proud, unrepentant admission of a monster. With Ethan Walker's confession recorded and the physical evidence secured, the case was handed over to the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office. Leading the prosecution was Assistant District Attorney Olivia Rodriguez, a seasoned prosecutor known for her meticulous preparation and her commanding presence in the courtroom. She understood that a confession, no matter how damning, was only one piece of the puzzle, especially when dealing with a juvenile defendant whose statement could be challenged in court. Her primary objective was to build a case so overwhelmingly fortified with evidence that it would be impervious to any legal assaults from the defense, ensuring that Ethan Walker would be tried as an adult and held fully accountable for his actions. The first step for Rodriguez and her team was to methodically catalog and analyze every piece of physical evidence. The blood-stained sneakers were sent for DNA analysis, which came back with a 1 in a billion match to David Campbell, irrefutably placing Ethan at the scene. The unique serrations on the knife found in Ethan's room were compared to the wound patterns documented in the autopsy report, revealing a perfect correspondence that identified it as the murder weapon. Furthermore, fibers from David Campbell's sweater were found on Ethan's hoodie, a crucial piece of trace evidence that documented the close physical contact of the struggle. Rodriguez knew that juries responded to tangible scientific proof, and she was assembling a fortress of forensic certainty around the defendant. While the forensic team worked, investigators delved into Ethan Walker's background, searching for the psychological context that would explain his monstrous act. They interviewed teachers, classmates, and neighbors, and a disturbing portrait began to emerge. He was described as intelligent but deeply antisocial, a young man who exhibited a profound lack of empathy and a penchant for casual cruelty, from bullying weaker students to torturing small animals. He lived in a world of his own making, governed by a sense of entitlement and a belief that the rules of society did not apply to him. This psychological profile was crucial for the prosecution, as it would help them counter the inevitable defense narrative of a troubled child who made a terrible mistake. Meanwhile, the court appointed Michael Clark, a veteran public defender, to represent Ethan Walker. Clark was an experienced and capable attorney, accustomed to handling the most difficult and often thankless cases in the criminal justice system. He knew from the moment he reviewed the case file that the evidence against his client was staggering, a veritable mountain of proof that made a not guilty verdict an impossibility. His strategy, therefore, would not be to argue innocence, but to mitigate the consequences. Clark's only viable path was to humanize Ethan, to frame the murder as a tragic anomaly born from a combination of adolescent immaturity and a troubled, unstable home life, hoping to avoid a transfer to adult court and secure a sentence in a juvenile facility rather than a state prison. Michael Clark's initial meetings with his client were a frustrating exercise in futility. Ethan showed no fear, no remorse, and no understanding of the gravity of his situation. He treated the legal proceedings as an elaborate game, viewing his attorney not as a lifeline, but as a pawn to be manipulated. He was more concerned with the details of his notoriety, asking if his case was on the local news than with the life he had taken or the decades he faced in prison. Clark found himself in the difficult position of trying to save a client who was actively sabotaging his own defense, his chilling arrogance a greater obstacle than any piece of evidence the prosecution could present. The prosecution's case was further solidified by a series of pre-trial motions, the most significant of which was the motion to transfer Ethan Walker's case from juvenile to adult court. Olivia Rodriguez argued passionately before Judge James Harris, presenting evidence of the crime's extreme brutality and Ethan's profound lack of remorse as indicators that he was beyond the rehabilitative scope of the juvenile system. She played excerpts from his taped confession, allowing his flat, emotionless voice to fill the courtroom, a chilling testament to his psychological state. She also introduced his sealed juvenile record, which detailed a pattern of escalating antisocial behavior that painted a clear picture of a developing predator. The defense in turn presented testimony from a court-appointed psychologist who spoke of Ethan's undeveloped adolescent brain and a history of parental neglect. Michael Clark argued that his client was a product of his environment, a damaged child who lacked the emotional maturity to comprehend the finality of his actions. He pleaded with the judge to give the boy a chance at rehabilitation, to not cast him away into the adult system where he would be lost forever. It was a classic nature versus nurture argument, a defense built on the shifting sands of psychological theory against the hard bedrock of forensic fact. After 2 days of hearings, Judge Harris delivered his ruling. He acknowledged the defense's arguments about Ethan's age and background, but ultimately found that the sheer brutality of the crime and the defendant's complete and utter lack of empathy warranted his trial as an adult. He cited the criminal sophistication of the act and the clear danger Ethan posed to the public, concluding that the juvenile system was inadequate to address the severity of the offense. The decision was a major victory for the prosecution and a devastating blow to the defense, ensuring that when Ethan Walker faced a jury, he would be judged not as a child, but as a man facing the full weight of the law. Through it all, Ethan sat at the defense table, a slight, almost imperceptible smirk on his face, as if he still believed it was all just a part of the game. With the trial now set in the Franklin County Court of Common Pleas, the focus of the defense shifted from legal strategy to psychological stagecraft. Michael Clark knew that the only currency he had left to spend with a jury was pity, and the only way to earn it was to coax some semblance of remorse from his client. The legal battle was all but lost. The war for perception, however, was just beginning. His task was to transform Ethan Walker, the unrepentant killer, into Ethan Walker, the tragic, misguided youth, a performance that would require his client's active and willing participation. The coaching sessions took place in the sterile, soundproofed meeting rooms of the county jail. Clark meticulously instructed Ethan on the subtleties of courtroom demeanor, how to sit, how to dress, how to project an aura of solemnity and regret. He advised him to keep his eyes downcast, to avoid making eye contact with the jury or the victim's family, and to listen to the testimony with a pained, contemplative expression. He even rehearsed nonverbal cues, like a slow, sorrowful shake of the head during the presentation of particularly gruesome evidence. It was a cynical, desperate form of theater, an attempt to construct a mask of remorse to hide the empty void beneath. Ethan, however, proved to be a difficult and unwilling student. He viewed his lawyer's instructions with open contempt, mocking the idea of feigning sadness as a sign of weakness. In his twisted worldview, remorse was an admission of guilt, and guilt was for the powerless. He saw the trial not as a reckoning for his actions, but as a platform for his own intellectual superiority, a stage on which he would outsmart the prosecutor, the judge, and the jury. This profound disconnect from reality created a growing chasm between Ethan and his own legal counsel, as Clark's attempts to save him were consistently undermined by the very person he was trying to protect. The pre-trial hearings became a public showcase for Ethan's burgeoning arrogance. During a motion to suppress his confession, a standard, if futile, legal maneuver by the defense. Ethan sat at the table doodling on a legal pad, occasionally looking up to smirk at the prosecutors or roll his eyes at the testimony of the detectives. His behavior was not the subtle defiance of a nervous teenager, but the brazen, open contempt of someone who believed he was untouchable. The local media, present for the hearing, began to report on his chilling demeanor, and the narrative of the smirking teen killer began to take root in the public consciousness long before the jury was even selected. Michael Clark's frustration mounted with each passing day. He found himself in an ethical and strategic nightmare, legally bound to defend a client who seemed intent on engineering his own conviction. He tried different approaches, from stern warnings about the consequences of his behavior to desperate appeals to his self-interest, explaining that a jury would not hesitate to sentence a remorseless killer to life in prison. But his words were like water on stone. Ethan's narcissism was a fortress, deflecting any attempt to breach his delusion of invincibility. He simply could not comprehend a world in which he was not the smartest person in the room, a world in which his actions had real, permanent consequences. For Olivia Rodriguez and the prosecution team, Ethan's behavior was an unexpected gift. Every smirk, every eye roll, every display of casual indifference was a nail in his own legal coffin. While Michael Clark was trying to build a fragile narrative of a troubled child, Ethan himself was providing the jury with a real-time demonstration of his true character. Rodriguez instructed her team to simply observe and document, to let the defendant be his own worst enemy. Her trial strategy began to crystallize. She would present the cold, hard facts of the case, and then let the jury see the monster with their own eyes, confident that his arrogance would be more damning than any testimony she could elicit. The tension between Ethan and his mother, Elizabeth Walker, also began to fracture. During her visits to the jail, she pleaded with him to listen to his lawyer, to show some sign of remorse for the sake of his own future. But her words were met with the same dismissive contempt he showed Michael Clark. He saw her tears, not as expressions of a mother's anguish, but as a manipulative display of weakness. Their conversations grew more strained, her desperate attempts to connect with her son blocked by the impenetrable wall of his pathology. She was beginning to see that the boy she had raised, the child she had enabled and protected for years, was a stranger to her, a chilling enigma whose depths she was only now beginning to comprehend. The final pre-trial hearing was a dress rehearsal for the disaster to come. As the prosecutor outlined the horrific details of the murder weapon, Ethan let out a short, audible laugh, a sound so shocking and out of place that a wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Judge Harris slammed his gavel, his face a mask of cold fury, and warned the defendant that any further outbursts would result in his removal from the proceedings. But the damage was done. The mask of remorse had not just slipped, it had been torn off and thrown to the ground by Ethan himself, revealing the sneering, unrepentant face of a killer who was eagerly awaiting his moment in the spotlight. Michael Clark could only put his head in his hands, knowing that the trial ahead would not be a defense, but an exercise in damage control for a fire his own client had gleefully set. The first day of the trial of the state of Ohio versus Ethan Walker dawned cold and gray, the weather a fitting reflection of the solemn proceedings about to unfold within the walls of the Franklin County Courthouse. The courtroom was packed, a tense and somber assembly of media, legal professionals, and members of the public drawn in by the case's brutal nature. On one side of the room sat the family of David Campbell, their faces etched with a grief that had not subsided in the months since his death, their presence a silent, constant reminder of the human cost of the crime. On the other side, at the defense table, sat Ethan Walker, dressed in a borrowed suit 2 sizes too big, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk playing at the corners of his mouth as he surveyed the scene with the detached curiosity of a spectator. Jury selection had been a grueling process, with both the prosecution and the defense carefully vetting potential jurors for any biases that might sway their judgment. Olivia Rodriguez sought out logical, analytical thinkers who would be moved by the weight of forensic evidence, while Michael Clark looked for empathetic, compassionate individuals who might be receptive to a narrative of a troubled youth. After 3 days of questioning, a panel of 12 citizens and 2 alternates was seated, a cross-section of the community now tasked with rendering judgment on a crime that had shaken their city to its core. They took their seats in the jury box, their faces impassive, their eyes fixed on the young man whose fate now rested in their hands. The trial began, as all trials do, with the opening statements, a crucial first act in the legal drama where both sides lay out the roadmap of their case. Olivia Rodriguez approached the lectern with a quiet, confident authority. Her voice was clear and steady as she began to speak, not to the judge or the defense, but directly to the jury. She painted a vivid and heartbreaking portrait of David Campbell, not just as a victim, but as a beloved teacher, a devoted brother, and a kind neighbor, a man whose life of quiet contribution had been brutally extinguished for no reason at all. She described him as a pillar of the community, a man who built his life around knowledge and kindness, making the senselessness of his death all the more profound. Rodriguez then transitioned to the crime itself, her tone shifting from sorrowful to surgical. She methodically laid out the evidence the jury would see, the DNA, the murder weapon, the security camera footage, and most importantly, the defendant's own chilling, emotionless confession. She used powerful, evocative language, describing the crime not as a mistake, but as an act of profound moral vacancy. She ended her statement by pointing directly at the defendant, her voice ringing with conviction. "Over the next few days," she declared, "you will see the evidence, you will hear the testimony, and you will look into the eyes of the young man who committed this terrible act. And you will see not a lost child, but a cold, calculating killer who even now, at this very moment, shows not a flicker of remorse for what he has done." Then it was Michael Clark's turn. He approached the jury with the weary, burdened air of a man carrying an impossible weight. His strategy was one of concession and redirection. He did not contest the basic facts of the case, acknowledging that his client was responsible for David Campbell's death. This was a calculated risk, designed to build a sliver of credibility with the jury by not insulting their intelligence with an unbelievable claim of innocence. The core of his argument, he explained, was not about what happened, but why it happened. He promised the jury they would hear a different story, a story of a boy lost in a storm of neglect, psychological turmoil, and undiagnosed mental health issues. Clark painted a picture of Ethan's life as a desolate landscape of emotional abandonment, a world where he was left to navigate the treacherous waters of adolescence without guidance or support. He spoke of a broken boy, not a monster, and framed the killing as a catastrophic failure of his undeveloped mind to process impulse and consequence. He pleaded with the jury to look beyond the horrific act and see the damaged child beneath, urging them to choose compassion over condemnation, rehabilitation over retribution. It was a masterfully delivered speech, a heartfelt appeal to the jury's better angels. Its effectiveness, however, was being systematically dismantled by the very person it was designed to save. Throughout both opening statements, Ethan Walker's behavior was a masterclass in self-sabotage. While Rodriguez detailed the brutal evidence against him, he stifled a yawn, his boredom on full display for the jury to see. When his own lawyer spoke of his troubled past and psychological torment, Ethan shook his head almost imperceptibly, a small, dismissive gesture that communicated a clear message. He did not believe a word of it. He fidgeted with his tie, whispered to his lawyer, and scanned the faces in the gallery with an air of detached amusement, his smirk occasionally widening into a full-blown grin when he caught someone's eye. The contrast between the solemnity of the proceedings and the defendant's casual demeanor was a chasm that grew wider with each passing moment. The jury, a captive audience to this display, watched him with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. His behavior was not just disrespectful, it was alien, a complete rejection of the social and moral contract that governed the courtroom and the world outside it. Michael Clarke's carefully constructed narrative of a broken boy was crumbling before his eyes, being replaced by the far more compelling and terrifying reality that Olivia Rodriguez had promised, the reality of a killer who simply did not care. The trial had just begun, but the most powerful evidence against Ethan Walker was already on full display. With the opening statements concluded, the trial moved into its evidentiary phase, and Olivia Rodriguez began to construct her case, brick by methodical brick. Her presentation was a masterclass in narrative control, designed to lead the jury on an inexorable journey from the initial 911 call to the defendant's chilling confession. She began by calling the first responders to the stand, police officers and paramedics who described the horrific scene they discovered at David Campbell's home in grim professional detail. Their testimony was stark and unadorned, painting a picture of brutal violence that immediately stripped away any clinical detachment and grounded the proceedings in the raw physical reality of the crime. Next came the forensic experts, a procession of scientists and lab technicians who translated the silent language of the evidence into clear, irrefutable facts. The DNA analyst testified that the blood on Ethan's sneakers was a conclusive match to David Campbell. The toolmark expert confirmed that the serrated knife from Ethan's bedroom was, to a scientific certainty, the weapon used in the attack. Each piece of testimony was supported by large, clear visual aids, photographs of the evidence, DNA charts, and microscopic comparisons that made the complex science accessible to the jury. Rodriguez conducted her questioning with a calm, deliberate pace, allowing the weight of each fact to settle in the courtroom before moving on to the next, building an inescapable wall of proof around the defendant. Throughout this damning presentation, Ethan Walker's behavior grew increasingly brazen. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, affecting an air of profound boredom. When the crime scene photos were displayed on the large screen for the jury, showing the devastating aftermath of his actions, he stared at them with a detached, analytical curiosity, as if studying a piece of abstract art. Several jurors flinched and looked away from the graphic images, but Ethan's gaze never wavered. At one point, during the testimony of the medical examiner who detailed the 28 separate stab wounds, Ethan was seen whispering to his lawyer and letting out a small, quiet laugh, a sound that, while barely audible, was seen by several members of the jury and the victim's family. Amelia Sanchez, David Campbell's sister, had to be escorted from the courtroom in tears, her composure finally breaking under the dual weight of the graphic testimony and the defendant's sickening disrespect. Her choked sobs were a stark counterpoint to Ethan's casual indifference, a moment of raw human grief that seemed to suck the air out of the room. Judge Harris paused the proceedings, his eyes fixed on Ethan with a look of undisguised contempt. He issued a stern warning to the defense table, his voice low and dangerous, making it clear that the court's patience was wearing thin. But the warnings had no effect. Ethan was in his own world, immune to the authority of the court and the pain of others. The centerpiece of the prosecution's case was the playing of Ethan's taped confession. The courtroom fell into a deep, uncomfortable silence as his voice, flat, emotionless, and tinged with a faint adolescent arrogance, filled the space. The jury listened intently as Ethan recounted the murder with the same casual detachment he would use to describe a movie he had seen. He talked about his boredom, his curiosity, and the disappointing lack of a real fight from his victim. There was no hint of remorse, no flicker of regret, only the cold, clinical recitation of a monstrous act. It was, as Rodriguez had intended, the clearest possible window into his soul, and it revealed nothing but a chilling, empty void. As his own voice echoed through the courtroom, admitting to the horrific crime, Ethan watched the jury's reaction. He seemed to be studying their faces, not for signs of sympathy or condemnation, but as if they were subjects in an experiment. The smirk returned to his face, a clear, unambiguous expression of pride and defiance. He was not ashamed of what he had done. He was proud of it. He had created this moment. He was the center of this drama, and in his mind, that made him powerful. The confession, meant to be the prosecution's ultimate weapon, had also become Ethan's ultimate performance, a public declaration of his own perceived superiority. When the tape ended, a heavy silence hung in the air. Olivia Rodriguez stood at her table, allowing the impact of the confession to linger, her expression somber. She had presented her case with devastating efficiency, laying out a chain of evidence so strong and a psychological portrait so clear that it seemed to leave no room for doubt. The physical evidence proved that Ethan Walker had committed the act. His own words, and more importantly, his behavior in the courtroom, proved that he had done so without a conscience. Michael Clark sat at the defense table, the weight of his client's self-destruction pressing down on him. He had known the prosecution's case was strong, but he had underestimated the power of Ethan's own personality to amplify its impact. Every attempt he had planned to build sympathy for his client had been preemptively destroyed by the defendant himself. As the prosecution rested its case, Clark knew he was not just facing a mountain of evidence, but a tidal wave of revulsion that his client had single-handedly created. He was now tasked with defending the indefensible, with finding the humanity in a young man who had shown none. The burden now shifted to Michael Clark, who rose to present his defense with the weary resignation of a soldier ordered on a suicide mission. His strategy was a delicate and desperate balancing act. He could not deny the facts, so he had to reframe them, attempting to transform the prosecution's narrative of a cold-blooded monster into a tragic story of a neglected and mentally ill child. His entire case hinged on the jury's ability to find a sliver of compassion for a defendant who had, up to this point, shown himself to be utterly undeserving of it. His first and only goal was to inject the concept of why into a case that seemed terrifyingly devoid of reason. Clark's first witness was a forensic psychologist, Dr. Evelyn Reed, a respected expert in adolescent brain development and antisocial personality disorders. Reed testified that Ethan exhibited many of the classic traits of a teenager with severe conduct disorder and narcissistic tendencies, compounded by what she described as a profoundly deficient empathetic capacity. She explained to the jury, using simplified charts and diagrams, how the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control and understanding consequences, is not fully developed in teenagers. She argued that while Ethan understood the difference between right and wrong on an intellectual level, he lacked the neurological hardware to process the emotional weight and finality of his actions. During his direct examination, Clark guided Dr. Reed through Ethan's bleak family history, which was characterized by emotional neglect from a distant, often absent father and inconsistent, enabling behavior from his mother. Reed testified that this environment likely exacerbated Ethan's underlying psychological issues, creating a perfect storm for a catastrophic breakdown of moral reasoning. The narrative she presented was one of a damaged product of a broken system, a boy whose internal wiring was faulty and whose external support structure was non-existent. It was a compelling, if theoretical, argument, an attempt to replace the image of a monster with the more palatable image of a victim of circumstance and biology. However, the effectiveness of Dr. Reed's testimony was severely blunted during cross-examination by Olivia Rodriguez. With surgical precision, Rodriguez dismantled the defense's narrative, forcing Dr. Reed to concede that millions of teenagers have undeveloped brains and come from difficult homes without resorting to brutal murder. She asked, "Dr. Reed, are you saying that a difficult childhood is an excuse for stabbing a man 28 times?" The question, sharp and direct, hung in the air, highlighting the vast gap between psychological theory and the brutal reality of the crime. Rodriguez forced the psychologist to admit that, ultimately, Ethan had made a choice, a series of choices, that led him to David Campbell's door. Throughout Dr. Reed's testimony, Ethan watched with a smug, knowing look on his face, as if her clinical diagnosis of his pathology was a badge of honor, a confirmation of his unique and complex nature. He nodded along as she described his narcissistic traits, a flicker of pride in his eyes. He was not the broken boy his lawyer was trying to portray. In his mind, he was a fascinating case study, a superior specimen whose actions were beyond the comprehension of the simple-minded jurors. His demeanor actively contradicted the very essence of his own defense, silently screaming to the jury that he was not a victim, but a proud and willing participant in his own monstrosity. Clark's next witnesses were a handful of teachers and a former guidance counselor who all painted a consistent picture of a troubled and isolated young man. They spoke of his academic intelligence, but also of his social alienation, his subtle cruelty to other students, and his complete refusal to accept responsibility for his actions. While Clark had hoped their testimony would elicit sympathy, it had the opposite effect. Their stories, meant to illustrate a cry for help, instead sounded like a series of red flags that had been ignored, creating a portrait of a predator in development. Each anecdote of his past behavior served only to reinforce the image of the cold, arrogant young man the jury saw before them every day. The final witness for the defense was intended to be Ethan's mother, Elizabeth Walker. Michael Clark had prepped her for weeks, hoping she could provide a tearful, humanizing portrait of her son, speaking of the sweet child he once was before he became lost to his inner demons. It was a high-risk, high-reward strategy, a last-ditch effort to appeal to the jury's emotions. However, in a private conference just before she was due to take the stand, Elizabeth broke down, confessing to Clark that she could not, in good conscience, deliver the narrative he had crafted. She had seen her son's behavior in court, and a terrible, dawning realization had taken hold, forcing her to confront a truth she had spent years avoiding. And so, with his key witness refusing to cooperate in the intended manner, Michael Clark was forced to rest his case. The defense's narrative, already undermined by the defendant himself and chipped away by the prosecution's cross-examination, had ended not with a powerful emotional appeal, but with a whimper. He had thrown psychological theories and stories of a troubled past at the solid wall of the prosecution's evidence, but nothing had stuck. The jury was left with two competing images, the defense's theoretical broken boy and the prosecution's very real, very present monster who at that very moment was smirking at his lawyer's obvious defeat. With the defense having rested its case, the trial moved into its final poignant phase before closing arguments, the victim impact statements. This was the moment the court officially acknowledged that the crime had not just broken laws, but had shattered human lives. It was an opportunity for the family of David Campbell to address the court, and the man who had murdered their loved one directly to give voice to the grief and devastation that had been a silent, ever-present character in the courtroom drama. The atmosphere in the room grew heavy with anticipation, the usual legalistic proceedings giving way to a more raw and personal form of testimony. Amelia Sanchez, David's sister, was the first to speak. She walked to the podium, her steps unsteady, clutching a folded piece of paper in her trembling hands. Her voice, when she began to speak, was thick with unshed tears, but it held a core of unwavering strength. She did not speak of the crime or the evidence. She spoke of David. She told the court about his infectious laugh, his terrible puns, his kindness to stray animals, and the way he would light up when explaining a piece of history to one of his students. She painted a portrait of a life rich in small, meaningful moments, a life that was a gift to everyone who knew him. He was not just a name in a case file, she said, her eyes finding Ethan Walker's across the room. He was my brother. He was the kindest man I have ever known. And you took him from us. You took him, and you left a hole that will never, ever be filled. Her words were not spoken with rage, but with a profound, bottomless sorrow that was far more powerful. She spoke of the holidays that would never be the same, the family traditions broken forever, and the silence where his voice should be. Her statement was a testament to the true nature of murder, not a single act of violence, but a permanent amputation of a family's soul. As Amelia Sanchez spoke, pouring her heart out to the court, Ethan Walker watched her with a look of cold, clinical detachment. He showed no sadness, no empathy, no reaction at all. He simply stared, his expression blank, as if he were watching a television show that he found mildly uninteresting. There was no flicker of humanity in his eyes, no recognition of the immense pain his actions had caused. To him, her grief was an abstraction, a foreign language he could not and did not want to understand. For the jury and everyone else in the courtroom, his lack of reaction was perhaps the most damning evidence yet, a final, horrifying confirmation of the empty space where his conscience should have been. After Amelia finished and returned to her seat, enveloped in the arms of her husband, the prosecution informed the judge that they had no further statements. The trial seemed to be moving toward its conclusion. But just as Judge Harris was about to address the lawyers to schedule closing arguments, a figure stood up in the gallery. It was Elizabeth Walker, Ethan's mother. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed, but her posture was resolute. "Your Honor," she said, her voice shaking but clear, I need to speak." A wave of surprise and confusion swept through the courtroom. Michael Clark shot to his feet, objecting immediately, stating that the defense had already rested its case. Olivia Rodriguez, though taken aback, remained silent, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Judge Harris looked down at the distraught woman, his expression a mixture of sternness and curiosity. He knew this was highly irregular, a breach of standard courtroom procedure, but he also saw in her eyes a desperation and a need that transcended legal protocol. "Mrs. Walker," the judge said, his voice even, "the time for testimony has passed. On what grounds do you wish to address the court?" "On the grounds of the truth," she replied, her voice gaining strength. "The whole truth. Not the story my son's lawyer wanted me to tell. Not the story I've been telling myself for years. The truth about who my son is and what I helped him become." The courtroom was utterly silent. Michael Clark looked at his client's mother with a sense of dread, realizing his carefully constructed defense was about to be completely and utterly annihilated. Ethan stared at his mother, the smirk finally gone from his face, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated fury. This was a betrayal he had not anticipated, a variable he had not controlled. For the first time in the entire trial, the mask of cool indifference shattered, revealing the raging, entitled monster beneath. Judge Harris considered the request for a long moment, the fate of the trial hanging in the balance, before nodding slowly. "The court will allow it," he said, his voice echoing in the silent room. "Mrs. Walker, you may approach the witness stand." Elizabeth Walker walked to the witness stand as if in a trance, her movements slow and deliberate. She did not look at her son, whose eyes were now burning with a hateful glare, nor at the jury, who watched her with rapt attention. She took the oath, her hand trembling slightly as she placed it on the Bible, her voice barely a whisper as she swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. This was not a legal proceeding anymore. It was a confession, a final desperate act of a mother who had reached the absolute end of her rope, ready to set fire to the lies she had spent a lifetime building to protect her child. Olivia Rodriguez, recognizing the gravity of the moment, approached the stand with a gentle, questioning demeanor, her usual prosecutorial sharpness softened. "Mrs. Walker," she began, "you told the judge you wanted to tell the truth. What is the truth you need this court to hear?" Elizabeth took a deep, shuddering breath, her gaze fixed on some distant point, and began to speak. Her testimony was not a structured narrative, but a torrent of painful memories, a flood of repressed guilt and dawning horror that she had held back for years. She dismantled, piece by painful piece, the defense's narrative of a broken boy who was a victim of neglect. She told the court that Ethan had not been neglected. He had been enabled. From a very young age, he had displayed a chilling lack of empathy and a propensity for cruelty, and she had consistently made excuses for him. She recounted how she had explained away his torturing of neighborhood pets as childish curiosity, and how she had dismissed his bullying of smaller children as boys being boys. She admitted to lying to teachers, to principals, and even to the police to protect him from the consequences of his increasingly disturbing behavior. She described a home where he was the center of the universe, a boy who was never told no, whose every whim was indulged, and whose every transgression was covered up. "I didn't want to see it," she said, her voice cracking with self-recrimination. "I wanted to believe he was just a difficult child, that he would grow out of it. I told myself that if I just loved him enough, he would be okay. But my love wasn't love, it was poison. I built him a world with no consequences, and I taught him that he was entitled to do whatever he wanted, to take whatever he wanted, because he was special." Her words were a devastating indictment of her own parenting, a raw and honest admission of her role in the creation of the monster sitting at the defense table. She then spoke of the years leading up to the murder, of Ethan's growing obsession with violence, his isolation, and his cold, dismissive treatment of her and his father. She confessed that she had been afraid of him, afraid of the cold emptiness in his eyes and the simmering rage that lay just beneath his calm exterior. The defense had painted a picture of a boy crying out for help, but his mother now painted a portrait of a predator who had been honing his skills in plain sight, protected by a mother's willful blindness. The turning point, she explained, was watching him in court, seeing him smirk and laugh at the pain of the Campbell family. It was in that moment that she finally understood that the boy she had been protecting was gone, replaced by something cold, hollow, and irredeemable. "When I saw him laugh," she whispered, tears now streaming down her face, "I finally saw him for who he is, not the little boy I remember, but the man he has become. He feels nothing for that family. He feels nothing for what he did. He only feels angry that he was caught." She turned her gaze from the prosecutor and looked directly at the jury, her eyes pleading for them to understand. "His lawyer told you he is a broken boy. But that's not the truth. The truth is, he is a broken thing. I know because I'm the one who broke him." The impact of her testimony was seismic. It was not new physical evidence, but it was the missing piece of the psychological puzzle, the Rosetta Stone that translated Ethan's baffling behavior into a clear and terrifying language. She had not excused her son, she had explained him, and in doing so, she had obliterated the last shred of sympathy anyone in the room might have felt for him. Michael Clark sat slumped in his chair, his face ashen, his defense in ruins around him. He had been utterly and completely blindsided, his case destroyed not by the prosecution, but by the one person he had counted on to save it. Ethan Walker's reaction was volcanic. The cold, controlled facade he had maintained for months finally shattered into a million pieces. He lunged forward, his chair screeching against the floor, his face contorted in a mask of pure rage. "You're lying," he screamed, his voice a raw, guttural roar. "You lying bitch!